G'day, guys. Welcome to another Hash It Out. In this episode, we're going to be talking about scalability and scaling solutions throughout the crypto industry. Joining once again, we have Armeanio and Noah. Welcome, gentlemen.
Howdy.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so scaling, Ergo sort of had that research-driven approach where it's got a lot in its toolbox when it comes to scaling, but let's sort of start from the beginning and sort of discuss why scaling is needed to get things started.
Sure. So there's a couple of reasons. Number one, when you have a decentralized network, you have to look at the networking side of it, right? It's a bunch of computers spread out around the globe that are talking to each other, that are essentially creating a replicated database. And you have, let's just say, finite data transfer that creates a certain bottleneck, right? We're on Zoom, right? And so there's going to be a certain latency between us, depending on how the network that's on the back end is congested, depending on our internet speed. There's a couple of factors involved, but you're always going to have a bottleneck in the network layer in a decentralized system.
Yeah, I think we've actually ironed out that latency issue for us on Zoom. I think it's we're pretty smooth with that at the moment because you can't really get much further apart where we are at the moment. So scaling that network sort of layer, what sort of solutions are involved in that one?
Sure. So, you do have some projects that just run crazy requirements, right? Where if you want to participate in consensus in certain networks, you need to have internet that's just not commonly available. You need to have computing power that's not consumer grade. And so it generally forces things towards enterprise versus people.
Yeah, you can see the massive data centers that are being popping up around the world at the moment. Obviously, the computing power in those is phenomenal. Alongside that with storage as well, I think that plays a big factor in scaling in the future as well with the growth of the blockchains once they sort of get up into the terabytes and petabytes actually sort of, sorry. No, so you were just about to say something, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, prior to this chat, I was sort of reading through an article about scaling and scalability specifically for Ergo, and maybe we can link it in the description or something, but it talks about vertical scaling compared to horizontal scaling. Vertical scaling being sort of what Armeanio was talking about, where it's like you throw as much computing power at a network as you can, enterprise.
Just throw solution. Resources at it.
Yeah, and that scales your network, but it's not a good solution for something like a blockchain where the goal is decentralization and distribution of the network across regular people, like you said. And the alternative being horizontal scaling, which is trying to scale the network through improvements of efficiency. So, people talk about layer 2 solutions, or they talk about, just like node improvements. Like right now we're working on V5 of the node, and that will bring, increased scalability to the network. Things like that, rather than just throwing resources at the network.
Yeah, it ties into the sort of work smarter, not harder sort of scenario in that respect as well, where we can make some optimizations on the code level, but then also even simple things like block size, being able to increase block size, put some more transactions within each block. I think, is it the SegWit scaling solution? I think that was sort of one thing that Bitcoin was looking at. I think that's basically sort of optimizing what data actually goes into each block. So there's numerous sort of solutions in regards to the horizontal side of things as well.
Yeah, it's hard because the reality is, you can look at the base of the network, right? But then you also have kind of like ancillary services, applications, things that require computing power on top of the network. You could use the example of a wallet, right? If you want to run full node, that takes some computational power that you have to localize and run in your own environment. Um, and if you opt for, a light wallet, well, you're using computing power, but it's not local, it's somewhere else. And, every once in a while, you have, let's just say something happens in one chain and you just kind of get a mad dash to the blockchain, like a moment where it's almost like an organic denial of service attack. And so, to some degree, that infrastructure has to be set up to scale vertically to support the user base if people aren't running, the computation locally. So, like every DApp developer, every infrastructure provider on top of the chain still runs into that same networking problem, where we've had that happen in Ergo. Luckily, it's been a while, but we've had a couple of times where our servers just kind of melt. Mass traffic comes in, and then light wallets are struggling, and so that vertical scale still has to be, versus a horizontal scale, still has to be like a point of concern for what's on top of the blockchain, what's the infrastructure around it, right? Everything takes computational power. And unfortunately, we do kind of exist in a space where the average user doesn't want to do all that.
Yeah, I think people have become pretty comfortable with the Web 2 sort of side of things as well, where everything's sort of hosted in the cloud, but behind the cloud are massive data centers, like I sort of mentioned earlier, and the infrastructures to support all that's like phenomenal. I think you just touched on like the bottlenecks and being sort of like, say, the Explorer, for instance. What sort of scaling solutions can we see there? Like multiple instances or people running things locally, each DApp sort of running its own instance, for example. What sort of things can we see across the board there?
Let's start with the ideal, right? And I'm fully aware we don't live in an ideal world. Okay. So the ideal solution is everybody uses local computational power and runs it themselves. It decentralizes the network. They don't need any let's say external servers that that then have to be set up to scale to traffic. So the ideal is local computation, right? But then you get into an issue like, okay, well, most users don't want to do that. Sad. I mean, that's the best thing for a real P2P network is you have P, not E. You don't have the enterprise type thing that sometimes we see in this space in extreme examples. So then it's like, okay, well, each team should probably have some redundancy, and that costs money, right? That has a cost. If I'm going to inherit your computational power as users, servers aren't free, right? And if I want to decentralize across services, that's not free. And if I want to set up my backend infrastructure to scale, in the event I do have one of these horde-like moments where you're just getting trampled, that's not free, right?
Middle attack.
Yeah, so you always are putting that let's say computational power somewhere. Somebody's carrying it, right? And then it's a matter of saying, okay, well, did they set it up properly, and can they sustain that long term? Because that is not free. And so that kind of goes back to the benefit of localized computation is you do not only eliminate certain choke points that potentially can interfere with how you interact with these systems, but it also localizes the computation necessary to do that, right? So, you're kind of offloading some of the traffic from other servers, or then the reality is something's not open and you can't run it locally. That's not even an option. Then you're just stuck with whatever service you're going with.
Yeah, I think it's really important as a community and ecosystem for everyone to consider accessibility of whatever is being created, so that the barrier to entry is as low as possible. We talk about the green button a bit, and if you can make local computation so easy that your grandma could hit the green button to do it, that makes scaling the network a lot easier. Um, you know, if if a full node wallet could be as attractive as a light node wallet, that's huge. It frees up a lot of dependency on those centralized bottlenecks that make scalability an issue with things like NFT drops or the Migoring thing. If everyone is running a full node and it's easy to do so, they just download it, and maybe it's using NIPAPOWs to make light clients more manageable for the average person, so that a full node is just more manageable. It just makes the barrier to entry so much lower, and I think that kind of helps with the vertical scaling in a way that is decentralized, and it's not just throwing resources from some central entity.
Yeah, and that builds upon like the decentralization of the network as well. So incentivizing people to be able to run full node wallets. I think just sort of one thing that's lacking a little at the moment is just a great UI experience. I think one example I keep referring to is a dataless wallet on Cardano. I really like the UI for that. It's very simplistic. It only shows what you sort of need to know as well for a full node wallet. It's pretty minimal in that respect. And I think we can sort of learn a lot from that. And I think Aberg's actually building a lot of on the UI side. So that's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, I saw he just brought on, I don't know how it happened, but there's some designer that is working with him to create a really beautiful looking UI. So I'm super excited about that. And it's really stupid, but I think a lot of the time people see like a really kind of raw, like janky looking, like developer oriented UI, and they won't even touch it. Like even if it's the best wallet in the world, they're not going to touch it if it doesn't look nice. So I think that'll go a long way, and I'm really stoked to see that. As stupid as it is.
That's the world
Yeah,
we live in.
there's a certain, education that has to happen where it's like, okay, well, if you're running a server on your computer, right? At which, you look at like Daedalus and the Cardano ecosystem, or full node wallet on Ergo. Yeah, it takes some time to sync. It's not as fast and sexy as not having to do any of that computation yourself, right?
Yeah, it can be unwieldy. You have to manage node releases, and
Yeah, you have to update your stuff. And yeah, we can green button that, but it's just a curiosity, let's say debate, that even like when in the EF we've had that, like, okay, well, we can try to encourage things to be run and kind of offload some of the computing power to users, but will they even do it? Right? Everybody loves decentralization until they realize it might take some localized work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we've mentioned it a couple of times just in regards to decentralization and like DeFi applications. The Mixer being a perfect example there, where you have to run it locally. Earlier you said that sort of offloading things off the network. So I think that sort of ties into the L2 solutions as well, where you're taking a lot of the sort of base load for transactions and P2P transactions and sort of those simple transactions off the base layer and sort of moving on to a L2 solutions. So I think Ergo's set up pretty well to host a number of sort of L2 solutions.
Yeah, there's a couple of prongs there to look at. It's a little different, right? So one thing that happens in a decentralized system is you have limited space, right? The network layer, the block size has some limit. And once you pass that threshold, not only can you potentially, experience some congestion in your network, your mempool backs up a little bit, but you also have the issue of who's going to get included in the block. And, the most common solution to that is to create what's called a fee market, where basically, miners mine for profit. And so users then end up having to offer some financial incentive to get into blocks. And what's the result of that in mass? Well, things can get expensive, right? And suddenly, it does kind of concentrate things to where larger wallets, larger players have an advantage, right? And so, not only, let's say the fee issue comes up, but, you also get longer confirmations, and it just makes the network a little bit less user friendly, even beyond what you have to pay. So, the idea was to create, use data compression techniques for the most part, to basically batch transactions into a second layer. There's, a variety of different ways to do that. And then you create a low fee environment. You potentially get faster throughput, users like that, but then you also have to ask on the flip side, did you just take away some incentive from miners? It's like, if the majority of transactions on Bitcoin move to Lightning, we might have an economic problem long term in terms of, who's going to actually pay for consensus to occur on the base layer. So there's a lot of moving parts there. It's not as simple of a problem as people sometimes approach it as.
Yeah, I was reading about Lightning Network, and the incentives don't make sense at all, it seems.
It's basically taking all those simple transactions, like the P2P transactions, and just running it fully externally once you've sort of locked up like a BTC on the base layer. And then sort of everything else occurs and throughout the nodes and the P2P side of things. And then it's obviously sort of settled at once those the Lightning channels are closed. It's a interesting sort of concept.
Just the financial incentives, though, it's very different. Like the miners don't benefit in the same way.
Yeah, I would say the two most common that we'll probably see, and it's not one nice thing about scaling as like a issue. It's scaling in a decentralized way. I do have to say that because you can scale in a centralized way. It's not a problem that's unique to one chain. It's not a problem that's unique to one ecosystem. So there are going to be a variety of solutions out there with their pros, cons, and it's, to some degree, it may be better to let other ecosystems lead a little bit and simply learn from their experience. That way, you don't be the one that releases something that then has an issue, because there are some potential issues with some scaling solutions. And the same thing is true with like side chains. We may end up seeing a future where application specific side chains become quite common or adopted. And so if you want to go interact with a side chain, you're going to kind of bridge to a chain with a different consensus mechanism, do something there, and then come back to kind of like the mother chain, I guess, the core, or who knows, maybe people will hang out there in that specific environment. We'll see. It's an open question, really. There's a lot of interesting solutions out there, but the reality is, you just need to watch things evolve and then ask the question, what makes sense where, and what can we optimize that makes the most sense for Ergo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something we've seen recently is GetBlock has introduced plasma scaling for their mining pools, I should say, which is really exciting. And from my understanding, that is a method of basically they're taking all of the miner shares, which is sort of a record of which miners are supposed to get which rewards for what they've done, is sort of my understanding. And there's a lot of information, and they compress it down into a smaller sized package, and then that package is what goes onto the blockchain, rather than all of those individual transactions having to go through multi-stage contracts and all this stuff. And it makes it much more efficient. That's my layman understanding. But it seems like there's a lot of potential.
Yeah, it's a solid layman understanding. It's just the simplest way to look at Plasma is you create a AVL database and it's just compressed.
Mm-hmm.
I say the same thing with NepoPals, right? That's a really fancy word. It's a compression technique. And so why do you want compression techniques? Because they use less computing power, they use less space, they make things more efficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with NepoPals, in a similar way, you're taking multiple blocks and sort of grouping them together. And I think it's called a super block or something like that. You compress many blocks down into a single block that interacts with the blockchain. So it's more efficient in that way.
Yeah, so it just compresses the chain. So the super blocks, I think I've explained it a couple of times actually, like it throws an extra zero on the hash. So with that, it just takes all those block headers and all the super blocks and sort of, for instance, you might start at 1, you might skip 50 blocks, and there might be another sort of super block or X amount of numbers in between. And then it's just looking at those block headers along the chain instead of sort of looking at every single block.
Mm.
So with the NepoPals as well, that's another sort of compression technique which wallets can utilize and obviously sort of bring that sort of full node security, but without the holding the entire state of the chain as well.
Yeah, I think the ideal with NepoPals is, they do support local computation that's a lot more friendly.
Yep. Yeah, it goes a long way in helping the green button, so to speak. If you can host a node on your phone or, on a laptop that is low end, anywhere in the world, you could have a decentralized network a lot easier.
Yeah, so just on that also, I just need to shout out and do a word. So number 14 is arena.
Speaking of latency, I just froze by things glitching out.
So yes, number 14, arena. Keep an eye out.
Oh, I think I know what that is.
Yes. So moving on, we've got a number of sort of different scaling solutions that we can sort of implement. One being Hydra. Obviously, there's a lot of sort of talk around the Cardano side with that and state channels. And can you give us a rundown of what an actual sort of state channel is?
Sure. State channels are interesting. You get a group of actors. They create like a multi-sig or threshold contract. And basically, you run a smart contract off-chain with some, mechanism of creating chronological order. Then at some point, they compress and submit that to chain and unlock the state, and the smart contract kind of distributes, transactions.
Seems very rigid.
Yeah, it's an interesting use case. I think that state channels are probably just one tool that might make sense in certain cases, but I don't think it's like the universal solution to scaling. Just a matter of when and where it makes sense. And we'll see. That's one of the beauties of having another extended UTXO blockchain is we do have the ability to learn from each other quite a bit. Plasma works well on Ergo in one area and Hydra works well in another area. we can plug them in where they make sense.
You mentioned that earlier by having sort of application-specific scaling solutions. So in one scenario, Plasma might be sort of beneficial in other state channels, but then also Lightning sort of for simple payments could be utilized. We couldn't, having the discussion in regards to sort of moving things off-chain. I remember there was a big sort of kerfuffle, I guess you could call it, in regards to Ethereum, where everything was wanting to be on chain, and then you see the scaling solutions that they've offered in regards to, say, just moving everything off chain now as a sort of benefit. I think they've sort of seen the light there, but then you see the actual community members, and they think that everything should be sort of run on chain there as well.
Sure. Well, that's just the bottleneck, right? You have limited space. And so once you run out of that limited space, what do you do?
That's the fee market, like you were saying. So
yeah, but then the fee market in and of itself starts to destroy the P2P aspect, because only the P's that have enough a big enough wallet to cover some of the fees, it tends to act as a barrier of entry. And ideally in a P2P network, that's something you want to keep minimal.
Right.
There's a lot of factors that you have to really consider and balance. It's not an easy problem to solve. I hear that a lot in the space, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah. Something I think is kind of interesting in regards to Ethereum too. People talk about the merge and proof of stake and all this stuff, and I think people have a misunderstanding about what the goal is, at least initially with the merge. My understanding is that it's not going to make scalability any better than it currently is. It's just moving to proof of stake.
Yeah,
it's changing the engine, basically.
It's changing consensus. It's not changing the network, the networking layer of that. You probably will have the same bottlenecks exist for every ecosystem, right? That's one thing that I think if you look at it as a network, you just have to take into account the physical reality of it. It's local computation around the world, connecting, creating a replicated ledger that everybody interacts with, and you have physical limitations with that. Now hopefully technology continues to advance, internet continues to speed up, computational power continues to increase, and so that burden of the network it kind of grows with technology, but it's always going to be there. You always have physical reality you got to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point in regards to sort of the contentious issue of TPS, or transaction per second, as well, and for sort of nodes and reaching consensus around the world, having the ability to be able to give those guys enough time to sort of, we talked about latency, sort of sending messages around the world. So for the network to be able to reach consensus and basically sync in that aspect, that's massive as well.
Yeah, it's really sexy market to TPS.
Yeah,
it really is. But then you could ask the question, okay, what even is the transaction, right? Like how complex is that? How much data is there? Not every transaction equals a transaction, so it's hard to even draw a baseline. And the reality is, once you're in the wild, like once you have users that are distributed all around the world that are performing different transactions with different applications and smart contracts, how do you even draw a baseline of what a transaction is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you can output to multiple addresses and all these complicated things. Yeah, it's not so clear. Something I hear compared sometimes is the the UTXO model being more easily scalable than the account model. And I was wondering maybe we could sort of dissect that and why UTXO lends itself to scalability in a way that maybe account doesn't, if it is true, because
Sure.
maybe it's not.
No. I think there are two factors there that you have to really look at. The first is that in UTXO you have local state.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of a powerful thing. Like, what is a UTXO anyway? People will say, "Oh, it's a box," which I don't think that really helps anyone. That doesn't understand crypto. It's a box, and they're like, Amazon box. What is this? You can think of it as like a one-time banknote, right? So it's a custom banknote, and that banknote, in order to be created, requires history of other one-time banknotes. So you have like local accounting, versus when you have the account model, you kind of have this universal method of accounting, which is somewhat easier for people to understand because they can look at their bank account. And if I send something to CW, it's -5 +5, right? It's not, I have a one-time, banknote that has my balance, and then he takes what's his, and then I get back the change, and then some miner, takes a fee, right? That's a little harder for people to grasp. But local state is a powerful driver of, the potential scalability of UTXO in general. Now, the second thing is you naturally, in extended UTXO, are on and off chain a lot, right? And if you look at basically every scaling solution that we see, you kind of hop off the chain and then submit data back to the chain, and hop off the chain and move data back to the chain. So there's actually a great deal of similarity in terms of scaling solutions. It's just an extended UTXO, that's naturally how things are designed to work.
Right.
I think it's pretty exciting, actually, anyway, in the regards to the EUTXO model and how it's all in the infancy at this stage, where people are sort of all just at the moment just discovering sort of what the potential are in regards to the scalability side, but then also local state side. There's one thing that's sort of been thrown around is concurrency issues, but then also flash loans, so not being able to sort of jump in and out of the same block on a single transaction. There's sort of different ways around that, isn't there?
Yeah, let's look at flash loans, right? It's true you can't do that in one transaction, but if you chain a transaction with a large enough fee, I think you could probably hit something in the same block. So I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it certainly is probably going to be expensive, and then
some miners going to be happy.
Yeah, some miners going to be happy, but they already are with flash loans, and to be honest, to some degree, that does add some economic efficiency to these systems. And, and it's a side tangent, but the reality is in most areas of the real world, the closer you are to something, the more power you have to, let's say I'm a bank, I can buy real estate before the consumer can, or if I'm a real estate agent, I might get that list before the person looking for a house can. There's a lot of times where you just have an advantage in terms of getting an asset. So I can't say that's like that different from just how the world generally does business. But now I've lost my train of thought.
EUTXO, flash loans, concurrency.
Concurrency basically uses a type of scaling solution. That's how, it's funny when that became like a drama, I guess.
Issue.
Yeah, it's a whole FUD for a whole month.
Yeah, in like 2019, Ilya came up with the base batching solution that he uses on Ergo Dex. We didn't even have a Dex yet. Like, there was no use case for it, right? So it's not something that was like not predicted, and known that there needed to be a solution, and the solution was created before it was even a problem. And that's it's really just how extended UTXO works. You need that type of batching to kind of keep local state.
One thing that I find fascinating, and I'm still fascinated by it, and even somewhat surprised actually, is the foresight that these guys have in regards to sort of the development, but then also potential issues. And you've mentioned it a couple of times, just along with Alex, he focuses on more on what he sort of doesn't know than what he does. I think that's pays testament to the core group of guys. It's huge.
Yeah, it can be painful having a conversation with people that think like that, to be honest. I actually really enjoy it. I get a lot of value from that, and to be honest, I've learned a lot having those type of conversations. But it's one of those things that things are always much simpler in your head than in reality.
Yeah, what is it like? You think you're smart, and then you learn more, and then you realize you don't know anything, and then you go back up. It's like the more you know, the more you realize the less you know, and then eventually you know everything.
I think the cool thing about that is actually a lot of the conversations are had out in public as well, so that open discussions and brings sort of brains trust from various sort of economic sort of areas in regards to DeFi discussions, but then also open consensus in regards to UTXO alliance. Cross chain with you have the collaboration with IOHK or IOG when they're developing Cardano with regards to sort of state channels. You can sort of dive into sort of all their research as well. I think having that open mind share in regard to sort of that open source solutions, but then also the open research as well. It goes a long way.
Yeah. It's a big question, because every scaling solution, requires some operators, and suddenly you go from like the really distributed consensus of the base layer to a smaller group of actors. And it really doesn't matter if you go to a side chain or to layer 2, and then you have another hiccup in the way, and that's some sort of bridging mechanism between the two, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what's the security of that, and how can that break down? So the questions get more complex rather than simpler, and ideally, I think we can create frameworks where each of those potential points of failure is, at least we talk about them, they're understood, and users can understand the assumptions of, okay, if you're going to take a bridge, who's operating that and what's the trust distribution. If you're going into a roll up or a state channel, who's operating it, and what's how is that trusted? How does that work? These are good conversations to have. It's easy to say this one thing is going to solve everything, and moon. But
yeah, I mean, scalability hasn't been solved yet. The questions.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't. There should be open questions, because everything has a certain trade-off. Everything has a certain weakness. That's why it's really important to say, okay, well, what makes sense where?
Yep.
And we have industry that's doing a tremendous amount of, research and testing. It's like ZK rollups could be absolutely huge, right? But the potential of exploiting them is you have the ability to potentially mint tokens without anybody realizing you're minting tokens. That's a problem, right? So if the cryptography breaks, that's like a major issue. Now, has it happened yet? No, but hopefully the assumptions hold, and we don't hear about that one day, but it is possible. And the only thing that's going to really determine that is time. Because you get into super complex cryptography, and hopefully the assumptions hold true, hopefully they're implemented correctly, and we don't see some roll-up solutions get exploited and free tokens released, but that's a risk, right? Everything has a certain risk or assumptions that we need to look at. I'm in no way against that as like an avenue of research and seeing all the different implementations that are coming out. I think some of them, Apache, Halo, are fascinating, but I'm also not fully on the train like it's going to save the world and everything is solved, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's only been in the last few years that this stuff has really come into fruition. I mean, it's still coming into fruition, so it can't even really say
Sure.
that. Like, it's all very new technology. Um, hasn't stood the test of time yet.
Yeah, it's born from necessity.
Right.
Well, luckily, one thing that you have to credit Ethereum for is because they were the first, chain with smart contracts to really run into that bottleneck. Like, they hit that wall pretty hard, seeing how, some of the fees spiked. That's good for them. They came out with a lot of potential solutions that, ideally, Ergo kind of hits that wall to where we say, okay, well, we have enough traffic that we need to put all of this data somewhere because it's overwhelming the base layer.
Yeah, very well put. I think we're just sort of running up into time now as well. So is there any sort of last words you want to have in regards to scalability and scaling solutions in the blockchain industry?
Me, I would just say deal with reality. Sometimes the marketing side of things, like, get way too starry-eyed and way too, this is the one size fits all magic bullet of infinite. um, I don't know. Yeah,
Throw a
keep it.
governance token in there, and you're good to go.
Keep your feet on the ground and ask questions and try to understand how these systems operate, because it's actually quite fascinating when you dig into it.
Yeah, and it really comes down to data compression. Like you said earlier, it's really easy to get sort of caught in the weeds of this stuff, especially for people that aren't super technically minded. But at the end of the day, you're taking a bunch of data here and trying to make it here so that the chain works easier. That's basically what
Yeah.
the goal is.
If I had any message, I would just say, users out there, computation is going to happen somewhere, right? And the more you can take your own local responsibility for that, the more decentralized the network.
Yeah, and for myself, just sort of like to mention that there is a lot of tribalism, obviously, in the crypto industry, and scaling solutions sort of will tie into that. And people sort of, like I said, say that their solution is the magic bullet or the silver bullet, and it'll sort of cure everything. There'll be sort of obviously different scaling solutions for different needs, for different applications, for different chains, different consensus models. So all that sort of stuff will all tie in together about what's required across the networks themselves. So guys, thanks for tuning in for this Hash It Out on scalability. It's been a pleasure talking to you guys once again. Armeanio and Noah, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, have a good one.
Cheers. See you guys.